Jewish podcasts in the world. So hopefully you'll join us for that live podcast. There's a limited number of people that can be in the live audience. I've sent you all the registration list. It's a registration form. It's free to join us, so register before we hit the maximum. I think that's about it. Remember, as we go along, if you have questions, you can chat them to me, and we'll try to get to them at the end. And I don't know if Sam, do I have to introduce you again? So I'll say if you
No, I think we should get right into it.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. Let's talk about the third in our three-part series on preservation of Jewish monuments in Eastern Europe. Again, we're focusing on commemorating Holocaust sites. I will mute myself and we will get started. Thank you.
Right. It's great to be back. And this is a very big topic. We're looking at Eastern Europe, so we don't have to worry about all the sites and all the memorials in Germany and France and Western Europe, and of course in the United States. But still there are probably over 1,000 memorials of different types that have been already set up at different places in Eastern Europe. Primarily, we're talking about the former Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, that area that was behind the Iron Curtain until 1989, 1990, when, due to the change of politics, it became okay again to talk about the Holocaust and to talk about the Holocaust as a event that affected Jews rather than, you know, victims of fascism or Russian citizens or many other labels that were applied that blurred or totally obfuscated the you know, the specific history of what happened in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. There was a rush in many of these newly democratic countries in order to confront and in some ways embrace, you know, a new understanding of history. The democratic forces were very strong in the 90s, but then there was pushback from nationalist groups, and that continues today in several countries. So there's a give and take as Holocaust recognition, Holocaust understanding, Holocaust education, and commemoration goes forward. And sometimes we see that in the results of the memorials that are erected, the memorial monuments that are put on cemetery sites, on mass grave sites, on ghetto sites, and death camp, labor and death camp sites as well. It's still an ongoing process, and it will continue into the next generation. And as the Holocaust story is retold, and you know, we don't know how everything will play out. I'm going to give you some examples of memorials that I know, and a few that I don't know that I've learned from other people, like Marla and Jay, who are on the call today. You know, some of this draws on my own experience that I indicated in the last talk. My work over 30 years with the World Monuments Fund in the early 90s, with the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad from the early 90s through about the year 2006, when I was very active with them as research director, and then continuing today my work with the International Survey of Jewish Monuments, and as a descendant of Eastern European Jews, and as a traveler, and as a lecturer and writer. So there are so many different types of Holocaust memorials, and even different types of Holocaust sites. So we're not going to be able to cover them all. And I've actually chosen for this talk to not talk about Auschwitz. Really, I'm going to show you one image, not talk about some of the better known, bigger places, which many people have seen in person or through various types of documentaries and exhibitions. And I want to take you to some places that probably you don't know, because the Holocaust, of course, didn't just take place in Auschwitz, even though Auschwitz has become synonymous with the horrors of the Holocaust. The Holocaust took place over much of Europe in thousands of locations and at sites that were very small, sites of humiliation and abuse and murder and destruction, and places that were bigger, ghettos, large ghettos, and of course, many different types of camps. But also, as you move east in the area that was under Soviet control before 1941, we have what we call the Holocaust of bullets, where really small groups of execution squads, these commando squads, came in and murdered tens, even hundreds of thousands of people in a very short time in mostly what's in Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine today. And this history of the Holocaust has been the slowest to be told, the slowest to be commemorated, and we're going to look at some of that today as well. So we talked last week about cemeteries, and I thought I'd pick up on that theme and just show you a series of monuments and memorials that have been erected since really the end of the Holocaust, when the first survivors came back to their homes, until this year. I mean, the process is still continuing. To give you some sense of the types of monuments that are going up on cemeteries, cemetery monuments they cover the past before the Holocaust, because they're commemorating all of those who were buried there before the destruction. But they also are surrogate monuments, or matsevot, gravestones, essentially, for all of those who came from that place and were taken away and never had a proper burial. They're also markers just to indicate the sanctity of the place, because sometimes all the gravestones are gone and you need something to indicate that what you're looking at is not just a field to be plowed, but a place where people are buried. But it's also often the only site in the town that is recognized both in collective memory, but also within the legal code as being Jewish. So it's the easiest place often to put up a memorial, not just for the past history of the cemetery, but encompassing the fate of the community itself in the Holocaust. It is the space, it is often contested space, because in the 70 years, in the 80 years since the destruction of communities, many of these cemeteries, as we saw last week, have been largely destroyed. And as I didn't show much, but I indicated, much the land was often expropriated by either individuals or by the state for other purposes. So getting that recognized as a cemetery, getting it back, re-sanctifying it, that's a very difficult thing, and it's a long process. The U.S. Commission was involved in this quite a lot, often quietly, so not to create a scene, because we got greater compliance from local governments if we didn't sort of take it to the press. But often the results were unsatisfactory. An apartment building's been built in a cemetery and you can't get it moved. So these are contested spaces, but given everything, they were more available to Jews to create commemorative monuments themselves for their own, and that's where we had the first memorials going up in the 1940s, like this one here from Wuklau in Poland, and many others which did not survive so long. So James Young, in his fantastic book, which is still essential reading, even though it's now almost 30 years old, Texture of Memory, talks about this process, this first process of memorialization right after the war by survivors. And, it was a cathartic experience. It was also like piling stones, and then many of these people were leaving in 48. They were moving west back to Germany, to DP camps. Many of them would then go on to Israel. So it was a way of essentially laying a stone again on the not just the cemetery of the family, but of the entire community, and sort of sealing that past before moving on. So one of the most common types of this type of memorial was what we call like a lapidary monument made up of pre-existing gravestones. And sometimes they were quite attractive, like this one, this pyramidal one, and all the stones are facing out, and all of them are upright because the people who built it were Jews, so they could read Hebrew, and it was done with respect. But sometimes time didn't allow this, and the stones were loosely piled, and then these piles over the years, came apart, or they were plundered. Later on, we'll have good intentioned local people sometimes emulating this process and building monuments, but they don't read Hebrew, so the stone might be upside down. They don't know what they're seeing. They just know that it is something that is in some way worth preserving, and so they engage in a process of recreation and consolidation and preservation. So this instance, this is from this comes from this was published in a magazine and promoted by Yad Vashem, the idea of 1948 and then 2018. So over the years, how these are Israeli students, but one can imagine that from those survivors, those people who did make this monument, who did emigrate, new generations have sprung. So from the cemetery, which is a garden of the living, or garden of life, as we talked about last time, we can actually imagine that there is this emanation, this continuation of Jewish life from generation to generation. So there are a lot of these, and I don't know the particulars about all of them, and some of them I've taken from Jay and Marla's, from Marla, it's actually Marla's site on monuments and cemeteries in Western Ukraine. And these have been done over several decades. And we can find these in many different countries. And some are aesthetically better than others, but you get the sense. And these are still being made. So this is an example of a recent lapidary monument where being made fairly well with steel and concrete, made to last at Ostro in Ukraine. And this is a monument that opened just during the pandemic. It's the newest example, and it's quite a lavish, quite a designed and well constructed memorial, really a structure in its own right, on the edge of the cemetery in Gorlice in Poland. And here you can see the stones that have been recovered, mounted on the walls. So whether we call this a Holocaust monument or a cemetery monument, it sort of depends on who you talk to. It is really both, because you can't look at any Jewish site, even a building that people once lived in, an apartment building, or a school, let alone a school or a hospital or an old age home or a synagogue or a study house, without thinking about the Holocaust, without remembering the Holocaust, without commemorating the Holocaust because of the loss. Even an empty lot where one of these buildings once stood, if we know what once stood there, becomes can become memorial. It really becomes a commemorative site once a sign goes up or a plaque goes up or some other a larger introduction. So cemeteries are certainly a loci of Holocaust commemoration. And when descendants of the town come to visit, or when children of survivors, grandchildren of survivors come to visit, they always go to the cemetery. That is the one place they must go to. And there they're remembering past generations going back very far, but they're also remembering the destruction of the community. But we have these monuments on cemeteries all across Eastern Europe, and they fall into a couple types. And I'm not going to go through all of the types. Marla provides a pretty good typology, but some of the most common ones are ones we would expect. So this one is from Mostar in Bosnia. We think of Mostar as this place of conflict between Muslims and Christians because of the Bosnian War, but there was a Jewish population right in the middle of this as well. And there was a synagogue and a cemetery. And this monument was built in 1999 after the Bosnian War. And the Jewish community was very important in sustaining, and Jewish international aid, very important to sustaining life for a lot of people in Mostar and in Sarajevo during that period. So this creates the idea of gravestones, of matsevot. A matseva is a Jewish gravestone. And so these are like stelae, they're slabs, and they have names of victims. So it combines the matseva form, the tombstone form, with the list of inscribed names. And those are two different types of memorials, but we find them frequently together. Here is in Mogilev in Belarus, on the left, this is a matseva type, but it's given a fancy sort of a symbolic base. It sits on a Mogen David, and then it has a menorah. So here we're combining the matseva with symbols, but that was typical in Jewish cemeteries and still is today, that we attach these to the monuments. And another example in Zolochev in Ukraine. I was actually here when this was being erected in the early 2000s. This was the dedication, and you can see there's a big a faux gravestone to make it look like a real gravestone for all of those who were not recognized. And then there's something more symbolic behind it. These are from the Rohatyn Jewish Heritage site, and these are just various examples of this matseva type of memorial. And then sometimes we'll find pseudo graves, false graves, because we don't know where the remains of those we want to remember are, and so we get memorials again that look like gravestones. And this is from the new cemetery in Lublin in Poland. This is a memorial that Rohatyn Jewish Heritage actually put up themselves. The remains of 12 people were found in a cellar. It's assumed they were Jewish because of the circumstances, and they were reinterred. Marla and Jake can tell us maybe in the Q&A exactly where this site is in connection to the larger Jewish cemetery, but a new stone, a memorial stone about these 12 people was created, and you can see it's in the traditional form, and it sits here in this field over the grave. I most recently looked at a lot of these places, I guess in 2017, 2018. I was in Lithuania a lot and driving around. So in Lithuania, we have cemeteries, most of which are destroyed. So we have very few stones. So the one on the left, the image on the left from Ukmergė, there are a few stones that were recovered, and you see them here. And then a new memorial, a big boulder, was put there. And the boulder is a very common marker for a lot of reasons, both symbolic, the kind of eternal strength of the boulder, but it's also there for very practical reasons. Boulders are the hardest type of monument to vandalize. So I recommend people that they use boulders and big blocks of stone, and to inscribe the inscription, if they can, into the stone, to cut it into the stone, because it's very hard to chisel off. If you have raised letters, as we'll see shortly, people can come and try to chisel them off, but a big stone with a carved inscription, very hard to vandalize. Sometimes, though, people put bronze plaques on these big stones, and the bronze plaques are stolen. Probably not because of anti-Semitism, but just because of the value of the metal. So this is Ukmergė. On the left is the cemetery, and then about 2 miles out of town, in the forest, there's the mass grave site. And you actually go through a big arch to get there, and there's a little place where you can park, and then there's this very beautifully kept, manicured area where the graves are, and this monument you see on top of it. And as you drive around Lithuania, as we'll see, there are a lot of these. A different type of site is are the killing sites and the mass graves, like the one we just saw. And we find a lot of these throughout the Baltic countries and Ukraine, because as I said, outside of every village and every town, people were taken and shot, and they were usually buried close to where they were executed. Sometimes they had to dig their own graves and were shot right over their graves. We all know, what happened at Babi Yar, but Babi Yar happened again and again and again and again. And there are even some sites that we'll see in a minute where as many people were killed as at Babi Yar, but most Americans anyway are not familiar with those places. We'll look at those memorials in a minute. In the early 2000s, I was involved in a project in Estonia to try to identify the labor camp sites that the Nazis set up there to try to develop a oil from shale industry. And in fact, a lot of our technology that we use today in fracking comes from this sort of Nazi German industrial endeavor. There were about 20 of these sites across Estonia, and Jews from many countries were shipped there for labors. Estonia had a very small Jewish population. Most of them had already moved east with the Russians, so they were safe. A few were stuck in Estonia and suffered under the Germans. So most of the people who died, about 20,000 people in Estonia, were Jews from Germany and from Czechoslovakia and from Lithuania, who were brought there essentially as slave labor to work in these camps. The camps were very brutal, and very few people survived the labor. They weren't executed in the sense of being sent to gas chambers or lined up against walls and shot, but they died of fatigue and malnutrition and disease, as was common at many of the labor camps. But that was part of the German plan. That's a way to kill people off. Then you replace them with new people shipped in from the ghettos. The largest site was Kluga, and this is actually the site that's closest to Tallinn, the capital. And this was also a place where when they were leaving, the most people were actually executed, trying to clean up the mess as the Russians came moving from the east. Around this time, in early 2000s, a new set of memorials were set up, this monument here in Kluga. And then what we were trying to do was to come up with identify the sites and come up with new markers that actually told the history of the labor camps, because previously in the Soviet period, they had been marked, but only with a red star and saying, victims of fascism died here, and never telling who these people were and what happened. And this is a visit with Celia Loud, who was then head of the Jewish community of Estonia. And she's pointing out to me as I'm taking these pictures, recent vandalism, which had tried to smash a lot of the raised writing on the monument. Fortunately, it's granite, so it's pretty hard to smash, but it did cause some damage that could not be easily repaired. These are just two of these other Russian monuments, two other sites in Estonia, and they're impressive monuments, but the history is not very revealing. The one on the right at Erida, and then this is just me standing by a boulder, one of these sites, and the local Jewish community from the nearest town where there were Jews, and I've forgotten the name. Actually, it was Via Vara, I think. And they put a new kind of plaque in front of the Russian boulder with the Jewish star, and actually says that Jews were killed here. But more common are these memorials on the mass grave sites, like the one I just showed you from Ukmergė in Lithuania. And we're seeing more and more of these. And most of these sites, now I can't say most, I've never really seen good counts where I can say this number and that number, but I would say a good percentage, large percentage of these sites were already identified during the Soviet period because there were trials after the war, and there was testimony taken, and people were actually tried and executed for their involvement, Germans and collaborators and others. So the location of a lot of these sites was known. Some of them were marked. The bigger ones were marked, and smaller ones were only remembered by the older people in the town. But since 1990, and really more in Ukraine since the early 2000s, there's been an increase in the building of new monuments and memorials, or the transitioning of the older ones with new plaques with texts giving some greater specificity. And these are just several images of places. I have not been to these particular places, but these are from Rohingya Jewish Heritage. And you can see the variety, but there's a certain conformity. In this case, there's a mass grave right next to the old cemetery. And you can see that a new kind of Matseva type memorial has been erected, where on the right there, on the far right of the screen, where the cemetery is. This is Busk. I actually showed you a picture of Busk last week, a very bucolic scene looking down over the river, and you can see the river, I think, over there on the left. When I visited Busk, there was no Holocaust memorial, so this is a newer addition. I don't know the year, but certainly I was there, I think, in 2003, probably the last time. I've also been to Drohobych, and I actually was able to interview before he died a guy who was most fundamental in restoring this site. And Drohobych was a big Jewish community. It's an important town in Western Ukraine, not far from Lviv. A lot of important people came from Drohobych, the artist Maritzi Gottlieb and Bruno Schultz, the writer and artist. It was an oil boom town, which is why it flourished, and the railroad came through. So there was a substantial Jewish population there, and they were almost all killed in these murders outside of the town. And in the forest outside of Drohobych, there is this trail into the mass graves. This is a photo from Rohingya Jewish Heritage, and I'm pretty certain these particular plaques were not there when I visited the site more than a decade ago. I don't know exactly when they were put on, but there are a series, I think there are 7 or 9, I can't remember exactly, of these mass graves. And this type of long tomb, a covered tomb, is what one becomes rather familiar with as you travel on these sites, because what the Germans would do, or their Ukrainian or Latvian or Lithuanian collaborators would do, they would dig these long pits, these trenches, or they would have the Jews dig these, and then they would shoot them, and they would, be thrown in. And these were generally found after the war, and the bodies were not exhumed, but they were sealed as mass graves. And then over time, because the concrete that seals them is not very good, these covers have to be remade. So again, this is from Rohingya Jewish Heritage, just a great collection of different types of these markers. And you can see the variety of the matsevot, and here you see the boulder types. Sometimes they're isolated, these very bucolic views. In Lithuania, where we're going to shift to just for a minute, there are some very substantial monuments that have been erected. This is a map from the website Holocaust Atlas for Lithuania. It's in print, and it's also all online. It's a very great resource for learning the Holocaust history of almost every place. And where you see all of these stars, there were communities and there were executions. So there are mass graves in most of those places, and there are cemeteries in most of these places. In the early 2000s, the Jewish community went around and put new monuments on most of the cemeteries, very basic ones, but a kind of standardized place to try to reclaim that area as Jewish. And then since then, a number of bigger projects, usually with state support, have been remaking the mass graves. This is in Babtai, which is sort of in the north of Kaunas. This has not been remade. This is an older mass grave from the Russian period, but at some point, and I'm not sure the date, there was a Yiddish inscription put there with a date and an explanation of who these people were and what happened to them. About 2,000 people were buried in the Babtai mass grave. They were brought from many different villages nearby. This is a rather this is a remade monument, and I'm not going to try to pronounce. I think it's Svencionis, but my pronunciation is probably way off. I have been there. These are photographs that I took in summer. This is some 2006. No, this is my sister, but I took a number several years ago. Genovo, and these are the ones that I want to bring to your attention, especially right now. We looked at the cemetery at Sedua last week, and in conjunction with the restoration of the cemetery, Sergei Kanovich and the whole team there have created new memorials on 3 mass grave sites that sort of ring the town in different directions. People were taken there and killed and buried. And then they've also made a new memorial in the town center for the whole Jewish community. These are beautifully designed monuments. Romas Kvintas was the sculptor who's responsible, and they're also very considerate of the people who visit them. There is like a parking, because you have to drive to these places, they're way out. But the parking is far enough away from the monument that it doesn't obstruct the experience, but close enough that elderly people can make it. But when they get to the monuments, there are benches that you can sit down and you can rest and you can contemplate. They're beautifully paved, and there are historically accurate inscriptions on these monuments. Each of the 3 monuments follows a different design, and they're all very attractive. And my recollection is they are trilingual in Hebrew, English, and Lithuanian. Significantly, Russian is not included in most of these inscriptions, even though most Jews in these countries speak Russian as their first language, not Lithuanian or Latvian. And they also, many of them emigrated from Russia because they were, during the Khrushchev era, they were encouraged to resettle these areas or to settle in these areas. So they've increased the Jewish populations, but they don't have ancestral roots in these places. So the construction's concrete. It's very basic construction, but very elegant design. And this is the sculpture in front of the town hall in the town center of a young girl, and there are flowers there. And this is dedicated to the entire community. And when I see this, I think of the rash of Anne Frank statues that one sees going up all over the world, from Alabama to, country to Australia. And I think of how Anne Frank became the poster child, really, for all children. But she never went. In her final days she did. But from her diary, we have a very different experience of the Holocaust than the kind of terror that the children in these communities would have known. But we know that 1.5 million children were killed in the Holocaust, maybe more. And what we're seeing now, I'm not showing you any, but there is an abundance of memorials specifically to children that are being erected, usually not on Holocaust sites themselves, but around America. There's one in Los Angeles at the Holocaust Museum there. There's a very famous memorial Moshe Safdie designed at Yad Vashem for children. So I'm taking you to one of the better known sites in Poland, which is Treblinka, which was not a camp, but only a killing place. And this is where most of the people from the Warsaw Ghetto were brought, only because I want to remind you of the design of this place that was so revolutionary in the 1960s when it was, in the 1980s when it was done. What was the date on it? Yeah, 1960s. Because it's a very abstract design, and it's a memorial that really blends in with the landscape. Here we see these concrete, like railway ties that represent the tracks, where the tracks went, where the trains came that brought the people to the site. And then we find this big memorial looking like a Ten Commandments, sort of, but with a menorah inscribed on the top. But the most striking element of Treblinka is this forest of stones. And they're like gravestones, they're like matzevot, and many cemeteries in small villages in this part of the world did just have rough stones. But the cragginess of this also has that kind of primeval quality of the boulders. But the stones here are meant to represent all of the communities that were destroyed, and then of course scattered on the ground are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of smaller stones and pebbles, which you can imagine are the individuals. Many stones have the names of places. And then here we have some of the mass graves, and these had been burned and carbonized, and this is the remains that we see today. So I want you to keep that in mind, because starting around, actually starting in the 80s, but not picking up until after 1990 and coming to fruition until the early 2000s, new treatments for some of the execution sites in Latvia were undertaken, and they very much emulate the effect of the design and the effect of Treblinka. And there are two of these outside of Riga that I want to bring your attention to, and this is the Rumbala site and in the Bikerniki forest. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these places, but over somewhere between 70 and maybe even as many as 90,000 Jews were killed in these places. Probably 35,000 at Rumbala and maybe 50,000 at Bikerniki forest. Pretty much all the Jews from Riga were killed there. Plus, when they finished killing all the Latvian Jews, they started bringing them Jews in from Germany and from other countries by train to fill the old ghetto and to use them as labor. But then soon they began to take them out and kill them as well. So between 1941 and 1943, this was a mass place of death, and it extends over a large area. Both of these sites extend over large areas. So as early as the 1960s, there was a memorial marker, which you see here in this little photo that was erected. You can see the hammer and sickle there. And significantly, it's actually it is written in Yiddish as well. And this was a very unusual situation. This stone was still visible when I first visited Rumbala. But then in 2002, the new memorial opened. And you can see this sculpture sort of reaches out over the road, like the terror kind of grabbing you, to tell you where you are. It says the signpost, instead of the usual little brown sign saying, mass grave this way, this leads you in. And then there are a series of markers and stones as you come into the site, giving you information. And I actually had some involvement with this monument when I was working with the commission, because we were involved. We gave some money. We raised some money for this project. And the condition of giving the money was that the language on the markers expressly said that it was the Germans and their collaborators, their Latvian, and their Latvian collaborators. You can see here it says Nazis and their local collaborators drove to death in the Rumbala forest thousands of Jews from the Riga ghetto. We debated for a long time whether we could get a real number there, like 35,000 Jews, But because nobody knows the exact number, the historians and the Latvian government people, I mean, could never come to any agreement. So we just did thousands. But the fact that we put local collaborators and the president of Latvia endorsed this almost brought down the government. It almost brought down the government, but it didn't. And it was a major turning point in Latvian Holocaust recognition, in recognizing the collaboration of many Latvians in the killing of Jews. Lithuania, much slower and much more resistant to this kind of language, but you will see this language on most of the memorials in Latvia today. So here are some scenes. You can spend hours and hours walking around this area. And the thing is, here again, here in the forest of Rumbula on November 30th and December 8th of 1941, the Nazis and their local collaborators shot dead more than, we did get 25,000 Jews. So we did get a number there, I forgot about that. The prisoners of the Riga ghetto, children, women, old people, as well as around 1,000 Jews deported from Germany. When I was at the commission, pretty much because of the obstinacy of the chairman, Warren Miller, who was very tough on this point, Warren felt, and I agree with him, that signage has to be very specific. You really have to be as clear and precise, but as truthful and as forthcoming with the history as you can be. To say never forget and don't tell people what they're not supposed to forget leaves a site open to any kind of interpretation and revisionism that is possible. So we always try to be very, very explicit in as many languages as possible. One of the projects of the commission, which I'm not talking about because it was East Germany, so we could have talked about it in the little camp in Buchenwald, is in 6 languages, and it's a very long text. And I helped write that and edit that text, and I know it took more than a year to get agreement that we could go forward with that language. Very hard to do. So Warren, really was insistent, and he said, if you're going to get U.S. government support or even our approval, just that we endorse what you're doing, you got to tell the story. So we get a lot of information in there. The U.S. Commission is acknowledged on this site, along with many of these other organizations. The Germans put up most of the money for the project. This is one of the mass graves, and the mass graves then are marked with stones, individual stones, and you can see what's going on. This is Bikerniki Forest, which is the other site. They're both designed by the same architect. He had begun these designs in the 1980s, wanting to do this, but couldn't go ahead. And then with the change in government in 91 and independence, everything had to be reinvented and redone again. And it wasn't until the late 90s that funding came through and the project went forward, and they were dedicated 2001, 2002. And they're very moving sites. The thing is, this is areas where people hike. This beautiful, these are these hills outside of Riga. So people hike, people ski in the winter. So there has been a fair amount of vandalism off and on. Sometimes the vandalism has just been, kids being mischievous. Sometimes there has been some pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic vandalism, but not so much. I mean, of course, every time it happens, it gets a newspaper story, but all the times it doesn't happen, that is never reported. It just takes one person. And then these trees, the forest, which to me is very important because it really is this sense of life in a place of death. And we're going to come back to this theme in just a minute. Okay, so I want to shift gears. And that really just scratches the surface. I mean, we could be showing these sites and talking about their history and, for a long, long time, but just gives you some instance of what's going on a little further east than many of you might be familiar. Now we're going to go to Warsaw and look at the most famous monument about the Holocaust. And I would go on about this for a long time. I'm going to do it in about 10 minutes. And we're going to look at the Warsaw Uprising Monument designed by Nathan Rappaport and dedicated in 1948 on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. This was what the ghetto looked like at the end of the war. Of course, the Germans had totally obliterated the ghetto after the uprising in April and May 1943. And after the war, when it was decided to rebuild Warsaw, because the Russians didn't even want Warsaw to be resettled. They just wanted basically to salt it like the Romans in Carthage so that nothing would ever grow there. No, but the Poles needed to rebuild Warsaw. But the area they invested in rebuilding the way it was the old city, which you can visit today, and it's still very charming. And the ghetto could not be rebuilt, which was mostly, a lot of it was 19th century buildings. And they just leveled it. So the rubble was just leveled, and basically a huge platform was created on which a new city, section of the city could be built. And that's where we are today. This photo, I believe, was taken before the museum was built. So the plaza was a little bit larger, and the approach up to the monument is a little bit longer. But you see the 1950s apartment buildings behind. So this monument incorporates a lot of standard architectural and art iconography for monuments. It's great to take apart in an art history class because it's pulling on so many different sources, and I'm going to lead you through that a little bit. It became the most important, it was for 50 years, the most important Holocaust memorial in the world, but it didn't really commemorate the Holocaust per se. It's really about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and the face that we see, the main facade, is about the heroism of the ghetto fighters, and it's not coincidental that this was dedicated in 48. Israel established its independence in 1948. And very soon after, when Yad Vashem was created, one of the first things they did was get copies of the reliefs, both on the front and the back of this monument, and brought to Israel for installation. The monument does a lot of things. It's like a giant gravestone, matseva. In the front, it has these menorahs supported by lions, which recall the menorahs in front of the great Plomacky Street Synagogue, which I showed you 2 weeks ago, I think. This was blown up by the Germans after the destruction of the putting down of the uprising and the destruction of the ghetto. And then it has this big bronze relief against this the stone wall behind. The wall, of course, is important for Jews, the Kotel in Jerusalem, and then the idea of the ghetto wall. These two things are conflated. So here we have the monument, the fighters pressed up against a wall, but the wall is also a gravestone, if you will. They are heroic, they are active, they're dignified, and they mostly are composites taken from a long history of art. Although the leader in the front, the determined look, holding the hand grenade, is meant to be Mordecai Anielewicz, who was the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So there's a tradition of this that already was beginning in the 20th century. We have war monuments for Jewish soldiers. This is from Berlin in the Wissency cemetery. And here we have the lion, or the dead lion, or the sleeping lion, representing the soldier. And I showed you this monument, very overgrown, last week from a cemetery in Hungary, in Jungos, and it's the lion with the arrows in it. And this is actually taken from a Near Eastern, very important Near Eastern relief, which is in the British, I think in the British Museum, of the slain lion. And that's the way the hero is represented from World War I. But here we have in Zionist art, beginning in the late 19th century and then continuing in the interwar period, a development of sort of heroic Jewish sculpture, which Jews did not do before this. They did little Moses and Aaron on breastplates of Torahs and things like that, but large sculpture was not sort of approved mostly in Jewish circles, and Jews were not allowed to study in sculpture academies, art academies, until the 19th century. So there isn't this tradition, but we find sculptors like Alfred Nozick and Boris Schatz and other people creating these Jewish figures who are heroic. So we have Judah HaMaccabee, and clearly Anielewicz is the new Maccabee. The ghetto fighters are the new Maccabees. Figures like this strong older man, derives from ancient Rome and from Bernini, and figures like all the figures have antecedents in Delacroix, like liberty leading the people, even there are some correspondences. Some of the same themes are picked up in more abstract work like Picasso's Guernica from just a few years before. We can see the bodies lying here and that sort of thing, and the heroic pose. On the back of the monument is a very different type of carving. Of course, that's the relief of those who are being deported, taken to the camps or taken to Treblinka, taken to their deaths, leaving the ghetto. And this really was the back, and people didn't see it very much, but it was the history that people weren't talking about so much at the time. But now we recognize there are many kinds of resistance, and we include all of these people who heroically survived for many years in the ghetto and were not responsible for their deaths. But you can compare the high relief and the low relief, and this here's again sources. This goes back to antiquity as well. We have the Titus relief from Rome of the plunder of the temple, and then as they're carrying the menorah, we see the rabbi here carrying a Torah scroll, and we have the procession from the Arapachis, which was very well known at the time in Rome. But we also have a tradition in Jewish art that begins in the 1880s and 90s, right after the pogroms begin in Russia in 1882, of Jewish social painters like Herzenberg and Reinlis and some of these other, Maritzi, Minkowski. You don't have to know who all these people are right now, but you'll see all of these pictures of refugees, of people leaving, and the processions of the dispossessed. So Rappaport is drawing on that too. So today the monument is still the central part of commemoration for the ghetto uprising, but for really everything about the Holocaust in Poland. But for many years, it also was the place for resistance to communism too. It was one place, because there was never a monument to all the Poles who died in the war, and there was never a monument to the Warsaw uprising of 1944. So this became a surrogate monument for non-Jewish Poles as well. This was the 70th anniversary when I was there, and you can see the flames are lit, and there were just lots of flowers laden. And that was meant to be the opening of the new museum, the Pauline Museum, which is right opposite. The building was open, but the exhibitions didn't open until the next year. And that's another story, but very important development in an amazing place. In recent years, there's been more effort to kind of tell the story of the ghetto. And there are new memorials in Warsaw, which kind of indicate this. The ghetto wall is gone, but they've begun tracing places of it and putting up little monuments so you can get a sense of the geography. Now there is a highly debated, contentious discussion of a Warsaw Ghetto museum being created. And there's just recently, there was a big letter in January on Holocaust Remembrance Day, not Yom HaShoah, but Holocaust Remembrance Day, by survivors, children, grandchildren of survivors, opposing this, because basically it's the Polish government taking charge, and they want to tell the story. They want to take it away from the Jews, and so there's a very, very contentious tug of war going on now, and it's really meant to as a governmental approved alternative to the Pauline Museum. So we'll have to see what happens. And then in the 80s and 90s, the memorial landscape of Warsaw expanded, and this memorial walk was put through to reclaim more of the space of the ghetto, even though it was gone. And Hannes Mollenberg and Władysław Klemmerus designed this memorial walk. And there are these stones which kind of tell little stories and commemorate different people. So you can see the landscape, the cityscape has entirely changed, but they're trying to anchor you into the past. And we have the mound where Mila Mila 18, 17, what was where the command headquarters for the ghetto uprising. And whoops, there we go. And more of these memorials. I won't go through them all. But it culminates with what was then the new monument of the Umschlagplatz, which was the last place the Jews would walk to, because this is where they would be put on trains and taken to Treblinka, which we saw before. And I want to end with showing you this monument, which is so modest and so different from the bravado of the Rappaport monument. Now, in between these two monuments, there'd been really the disastrous design for the Auschwitz monument in the 60s, which nobody really liked, which was essentially abstract, but tried to kind of give some indication of some figural forms and some coffin-like forms. It didn't work for meaning. It didn't work for pulling a space together architecturally, and it doesn't really work that much as a backdrop for ceremonies. The monument at Majdanek, somewhat better, but so impersonal, so overpowering. It really is. It doesn't humanize the victims in any way. This kind of sculpture was very common in the communist era. This is at the Ninth Fort in Kaunas, and this is from the early 80s. So what was done here in Warsaw was a totally different way of making a monument for a Holocaust memorial site. It's unprepossessing. It's very, very modest, very simple and elegant and light. It creates a room. The room is lined with these walls. So again, the power of the wall, and we think of the ghetto, of course, the stripe through the black stripe through the white makes us think of a prayer shawl wrapping around people. We come through a doorway and we have a sense of a matseva over the doorway in the tympanum, the arch over, and the scene is of a forest of trees that's been blown over, not cut even in the traditional way that we see in many cemeteries of a life cut short, but these have been destroyed like by a hurricane. And that's what the deportation was. And then we come through into this room, we're looking through a slot and we're seeing trees, live trees behind. But before we get there, we're in this little room with low benches. We can sit on these benches and it's as if we're sitting Shiva in someone's living room on the low stools. And it's like a synagogue. It's like a Beit HaKnesset, a place where we can get together, but it's also a place to sit Shiva. And then on the walls are names, not like all the specific names on the Bosnia, on the Mostar Bosnia monument, or on many bigger monuments too. These are all first names. Oh, sorry, we'll skip this. This is the Felix Nussbaum famous painting. We think of this corner of the wall. But here we get names, their first names of everyone who might have been in the ghetto. So of course I immediately go to my name, Shmuel, which is right there. When I'm in Paris and go to the big wall at the Memorial of the Shoah, I look at all the Grubers who were there. You know, one is drawn to these things, but one sees all the other names, Hessel, Pina, Pincus, Rubin, you know, and that is a way to, even in the austerity of this structure, to personalize it. So this is something that had begun already in Prague at the Pincus Synagogue in the 50s, had been lost in the 60s, and then was being repainted. It was lost at the time that monument was built. It had been closed down, but was repainted after the Velvet Revolution. And of course, we know it from the memorial at the Vietnam Memorial. But it's quite special here at this Umschlagplatz. And then I think seeing these trees is this great affirmation. So there's so much more to talk about, and I could show you or would show you the monument with the chairs in Krakow on the ghetto square, and the monument of the shoes on the banks of the Danube in Budapest. There's so many more interesting conceptual monuments and representative and symbolic monuments that have been made in recent years. But we don't have time. So another time we'll do that. We'll open it up to some questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Would you mind unsharing the
Yep,
screen?
I'm going to do that.
Questions. So people have been chatting questions as we've been going along, and we'll try to get to as many as we can just the next 10 or 15 minutes before I wrap it up. First question is, particularly focus on the first 40 minutes of your presentation, the killing fields, killing sites in Eastern Europe that are now marked, Lithuania and Ukraine and Latvia, Estonia. Do locals go visit these? Does anybody go visit them other than Jews who come to visit the towns their grandparents came from?
There are ceremonies. There are usually on the anniversaries of the massacres. They're often town-sponsored ceremonies and the laying of wreaths and things like that. I can't say that happens at everyone, but at many of the ones, certainly that I visited, and when you go, you'll see that often there are wreaths laid and things like that. I don't think many people go. They're listed in the certainly in Lithuania. They are now listed in the tourist guides and on the tourist maps of towns, and it's very easy to find your way. And they're usually signposts that will direct you if you're driving. So that's all new. So I think more people. There is this thing, and this is something that you asked what my sister likes to talk about. She talks a lot about dark tourism. There's a whole trend in what we call dark tourism, where people visit war sites and Holocaust sites and other things, not out of piety or remembrance, but just sometimes it's fascination, historical interest, but it's also a kind of just chalking up, being at one site of massacre and horror after another. So that, I don't know how much of that there is, but certainly that will, that may turn up. Genealogists obviously come, Jewish genealogists come in groups, but not that often. And student groups come, church groups come and do cleanups. It depends on the place. It really depends on the place.
So, and I know you've kind of given us the pieces of the puzzle throughout this 3-part series, but who is behind this, right? We got Marla and you've got Jay, so you got individuals, but is it who is the impetus to get these monuments up? Are they individuals like Marla and Jay? Are they government? Or the U.S. government? Is it local?
It really has changed over time. So in the 90s, governments were doing a lot because they wanted to get into NATO and they wanted to join the European Union. And one of the conditions to do that was so this doesn't apply to Ukraine so much, but Poland, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Latvia, was to introduce curriculum about the Holocaust into their schools, and to adopt certain language which recognized certain historical truths about the Holocaust, and to begin some kind of commissions or committees about commemoration and memorialization. This was done with great alacrity in some countries. It became confused in places like Lithuania, where you go to, there's a museum of genocide in Vilnius, and you go there thinking, oh, this is going to be about the Holocaust. No, it's all about the Soviet occupation of Lithuania. And only later did they add one little exhibition about what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. It's like one little thing. So the language, what we assume and what they assume, two different things. So it hasn't always been easy. Now, I would say from the late 90s, even continuing today, a lot of the, so then in the 80s, even under communists, and then in the 90s, religious groups, particularly Orthodox Jews, were the first to be visiting and documenting cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, trying to locate the graves of their rabbis and tzaddiks, and they would do these pilgrimages. And that's where you would often find one ohel built, as we saw last week, in a cemetery when nothing else was there, because they were fixated on that one thing. But we also saw that in belts, for instance, a whole complex was built, and they really contribute to the economy, and they have established a very a collaborative rapport with the local authorities. Then after the hesitation of many Jews in engaging with Eastern Europe, I used to give lectures trying to encourage people to donate to restorations of these places in the 90s, and people would say, "I'll never give a penny to Poland," or "Poland's just a place. They anti-Semitism with their brother's milk, everything." So there was so resistance. All the money we got for like the restoration of the Krakow, the Temple Synagogue in Krakow, that every Jew loves to go and visit now, mostly came from governmental or foundation or non-Jewish groups like the Getty, or, we couldn't get Jews to give to it. Then that, as people began to travel more and more, that began to change. And people realized that, it wasn't about anti-Semitism. A lot of it was about ignorance. People just hadn't been taught anything about Jews or the Holocaust for 50 years. And there was a great opportunity for engagement. And we saw local people, scout groups, churches, school groups, Israel, Poland, friendship organizations, all coming forward to help with a lot of these projects. And then Americans, and Canadians and Australians and French, began to get involved too. That said, I would say most of the heavy lifting is being done locally. It's being done locally by some Jews and some non-Jews working forward. So it's a mixed bag. And then we get, it's like, there's no one big funder. People used to say, "Oh, Ronald Lauder pays for everything you do." I said, Ronald Lauder pays for nothing we do. He puts his, he gives like, $50,000. We had anonymous donors, but Steven Spielberg pays for everything. No, Steven Spielberg didn't pay for anything. He did the show of testimonies, but he doesn't do restoration work. It's just you have to put together these coalitions, these packages, and there are so many individuals who are important. But the more people visit, this is where genealogists and these Jewish tours are so important. The more people visit, the more local people realize that, oh, they're interested in it, we'll be interested in it. But for so long, Jews didn't show any interest in it. Jews didn't care for these places. They said, well, why should if they don't think it's important, why should we think it's important?
Great
so
point.
A long answer to the question.
Right. So just a quick question about a case study. So Sedova, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Lithuania, seems to have a massive recent project going on. Is this, just tying into what we just talked about, is this an individual who has really made the difference there, or is it the town? Why is that particular part of Lithuania?
Well, that I know, there are two individuals that have made the difference. So the individual on the ground is Sergei Kanovich, who is a charismatic and creative person and has long roots there. So he's the creative force behind it all. But he has an angel who I don't know who it is, an anonymous donor. I think only one, but maybe there's a group from South Africa. They're South African of Lithuanian descent, or maybe they are survivors. I don't know. So they've bankrolled this project, and they want it to be a model project that will set a standard and influence, things going forward. And in Sergei, they have, an incredibly competent and charismatic person to lead it forward. But it is incredibly labor intensive. It's really a full-time effort, and it takes years to do this. You can't just come in for a weekend and get it done. I tried that a couple of times and it didn't work.
Well, so when we go back to Lithuania, we'll definitely go to check out that site. But I do a related question to that was asked by some people in the audience, and that is, what happens if there's someone in the audience and they want to put up a plaque, a small plaque, like Rabbi Savanor's family is from Gedrovich. He wants to put up a plaque to commemorate something historic that happened to the Jewish, bad history that happened to the Jewish community, or it could be another part of the history of the Jewish community. because why don't we commemorate some of the good stuff there as well? But that's either way. How much does it cost to do that? Like a small plaque in a certain location. If you can, I guess you have to build a coalition, but what is the cost to do that?
Well, it can be on the low end, it can be a couple $1,000s for even a basic plaque, because by the time, and then you're going to be travel, then you have to think you're probably going to go travel to work it, to install it. Basically, if you're doing it in many languages, you're going to have to translate, you're going to check the text, they're going to have to check the history to make sure it's right. You're going to have to install it. If it's bronze, it's going to be cast. If it's fiber, laminated fiberboard, whatever it is going to have to be made. In the 90s, it was very cheap to do these things. But now you're paying American prices or higher. So German price. So even a small thing can cost a bit, but it's certainly affordable. And there are many organizations that will do it, depending on the country, depending on the city. There's a structure that allows you to do it. So if you're in Poland, it might be through the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Monuments, FUJ, depending on the site. They certainly have many places that need to be marked, and many people do mark these sites, make donations to them. Sometimes you can do it directly through a municipality, but you're going to have a intermediary. In some places, you could bring it to the U.S. Commission. They do this, and one of the commissioners might take it up as a project. If you're putting up the money, the commission will do all the negotiating and all the work. And then, if it was in the area where Marla and Jay work, they might, I don't know, for Rohatyn Jewish Heritage might do something. If it's in, so each place has its own group. There are places where there are no groups, but fewer and fewer of those places. If you want to do it in Romania, you could do it through the Federation of Romanian Jewish Communities, FedRom. There's someone there who speaks English. You could deal with them, that kind of thing.
So if you want to do it, just email me. I'll put you in touch with Sam, and we'll figure out how to make it happen. My hope is that this 3-part series is not just educational, but it also is proactive and help and pushes forward memorialization of these sites. And if anybody here wants to do it, we'd like to make it happen. Right. Have you seen, where are we in memorialization right now? Is it have we leveled off? Is it increasing? Is it way down? Is it something that we're going to see more of or less of?
We may have still a bit to go before we level off, but there was a big push of desire, and a lot of people of a certain age and assets were able to do things in the 90s and early 2000s. There was more aspiration than ability to actually get things done in a lot of places. Now we have the ability to get things done, but we don't always have the people to do it. This has never been, as far as Jewish charitable giving, this has always been an infinitesimal amount of money compared to what goes to universities and hospitals and day schools and synagogues and even environmental things, anything you would think of. It's probably one of the smallest recognizable amounts. So everyone doing a project is scrounging everywhere, and there are only a couple foundations that regularly give money, and prices have gone up. That said, I think there's a lot going on. Governments are certainly more willing to partner, and then in the EU countries, the EU has put a lot of money into building restoration, and the Schengen countries, Norway and Iceland and others, have been doing a lot of investment in the Baltic countries, particularly with former wooden synagogues, because they have an expertise in wood architecture. So again, it's a lot of money from a lot of different places. There's no single, it's not a single path. But I can't say whether, I have not been on the ground that much in the last couple of years in Europe. I think it's leveling off in some places, but still has to take off in other places where there hasn't been much done. Also, money is coming from Russian oligarchs. we're seeing that in a few places. So we're seeing some synagogues restored and others.
Why is that?
I guess they have a lot of money to spend, and again, it's culture. They're Jewish, and but I can't tell you what all the dynamic there is. But in Ukraine, it's Satanev and a few others have been restored. I think with a single individual has just put a lot of money into a place.
I like Sharon Grosfeld's quote, and I think I hinted at it, that I think we need to mark sites of tragedy, but we also need to mark sites of just regular, famous people or communities that lived in certain towns that now are gone. So we have to have both, and not just the sites where mass murder took place.
Yes, and if I can just say, I know you want to close up here. That's really important because the Holocaust, obviously was a few years. It was massive destruction, but a few years in a 1,000-year history. And from the beginning of my work, I've always believed, and I'm not alone in this, that we don't want to define Jews by their destruction. We want to define them by their cultural achievement. But you have to strike a balance, and there are these joyous festivals that take place now in many European countries, Jewish festivals and things like that, which almost want to avoid the discussion of the Holocaust and avoid the fact that, oh, isn't it strange that we're all non-Jews here celebrating something Jewish? Where are the Jews? Well, they all were killed. So the most famous of these festivals is the Krakow Jewish Festival that takes place every June, which I first attended the second year, I think, in the early 90s. And at that time, it was defined as Poles dressing up as Jews to entertain German tourists, okay? Fortunately, within a very short time, that festival was totally transformed and was infused with real Jewish involvement and engagement, and it became an international place for Jewish artists, musicians, scholars, theologians, everybody to come together and to rediscover the Eastern European past. And it really helped to revive Krakow as a Jewish, not just a destination, but an active Jewish center, even though the real population, the Jewish population in Krakow is tiny, still just a few hundred today. And many of them are not from Krakow or even Poland. It has outside influence. And Jonathan Ornstein, who runs the JCC there, which I showed a picture of in my first lecture, is an enormous force in recreating or reinventing Jewish life in Eastern Europe. We're never going to be like we were there, but there are Jews there, and there is Jewish life there, Jewish culture.
So I think that's a great, actually, example of a different type of memorial, way to preserve Jewish history by these festivals. So thank you for bringing that up. That's an interesting point. And you can read what Sharon Grosfeld has been chatting about her work in Radom. And I think that we have to really work on these types of memorials in different ways. The more, the better. Let me end with a harder question. You avoided Auschwitz. Our trip in July 2019, we visited Treblinka. I think it was a very powerful place, and you talked about that. We went to Pinar, we went to the forest. We saw many of these monuments. Some of us went on side trips to see monuments in our families' towns. But I had a big challenge in Auschwitz in that the good side of it, and this particular memorial, first of all, we saw nobody at anywhere. I don't think we saw anybody in the Pinar forest. I didn't see anybody, any of the sites I went to in Rakashek or Pakroy. We didn't see anybody in Treblinka, like nobody. But we went to Auschwitz. It was, I hate to use this word, but it was like Disneyland. There's thousands and thousands of tourists and buses and tours. And I guess the good thing about that is a very successful opportunity to educate people about what happened. On the other hand, I would say it seemed like a desecration of a Jewish site. So I wanted to get your thoughts on a place like that, which is a successful, obviously a very successful monument to teach people about the history of the Holocaust, and yet I would say troubling in a little bit.
Yeah, I was spent 3 days in Auschwitz at Auschwitz at the Auschwitz Jewish Center and at Auschwitz in 2018, so not too long ago. And I spent must have been a 10-hour day at Auschwitz I and at Birkenau, trying to see everything, but also see it through the eyes of visitors and what they're seeing and watching people as well. So the first thing I would say is, yes, there are many, many sites, and it's important to go to other sites, and people feel compelled to go to Auschwitz, but I'm not sure it's the most important place to go to. If you really want to commune with, the past and to pay respects. But if you go, don't go in the summer, go in, with the winter. Actually, it feels more horrible. I've been in the winter, and it's you get a sense of what it might have been like for the prisoners. It doesn't look like a college campus. It looks like Auschwitz. You feel the chill, but also there are fewer people there. But if you do go in the summer, go when it opens, because it's open for 2 hours or only to people who come in individually. So no tours are allowed in for the first couple hours. And so you can get a head start. You can walk and to some extent stay ahead of the crowds and really have the place much more to yourself. So that would be a piece of advice. It has gotten much better now that everybody has these headsets and people are talking, the tour guides are talking at regular volume. It used to be, people shouting in every different language. Then it really felt like Disneyland. I didn't feel off this time. I felt that people really were looking at things seriously and with reverence. I was actually pleasantly, I was surprised. I was happily surprised. And I was, even though I've been there before and I teach this and I know the history, I was still terribly moved by my visit to Auschwitz. But I think going to someplace like Rumbala is cathartic. I mean, that, and if you read about what was going on, but you choose, and you should mix it up with. Now you can go and meet with real Jewish communities, living Jewish communities. There are so many wonderful things to see in these countries. You don't have to do just Jewish stuff. You can see Polish stuff, Lithuanian stuff. There are synagogues that have been restored. There's some nice museums. So you can mix it up. And most people that I encounter, of course, selective, are really eager and open and willing to talk and to engage, and with Americans and with Jews and, just with strangers, because they are, once you get out of the big cities, these are provincial places. It's like going to small towns in America. But always treat people with kindness and respect, and usually people will treat you the same way coming back.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap it up. I know it's a little late, but it was a third in our three-part series. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you, Dr. Gruber, for the three-part series on a very thoughtful three-part series on the preservation of Jewish monuments in Eastern Europe. Obviously, this could be a whole year course. There's a lot of material, but we covered some of the high-level issues and many of the sites. Thank you to the Osbornes for joining us for the three-part series and for all you do. And tomorrow with Dr. Sharon Killer, those of you who would like to continue the discussion, 12:30 p.m. for CSP members and members of our partners. I will share the link again in a follow-up email, but there'll be an opportunity to talk about some issues to each other. And Dr. Keller will present some topics for discussion. There'll be a more intimate exchange on this very challenging subject, a subject that is obviously still evolving and very creative, and has a lot more to go, I think. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Sunday. Sorry if we pulled you away from the Academy Awards. I think they may have started, I don't know. But since I did not see any films this year, this was my priority. Sharon Grosville, thank you really for your work. I know we've learned about it for years, and you came to meet our group before we went to Poland, and we appreciate you and everything you've done in the community as a model for what can be done in other parts of the community, other parts of Eastern Europe. And I hope that we can do it in my hometowns as well. So if you want to know more about Sharon's project, she chatted it, and you can email me. I'll give you her email. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Gruber. I will add that I've asked Dr. Gruber to create some 20, 25-minute standalone presentations about some very important projects, preservation projects around the United States and around the world. We'll be releasing those on YouTube, hopefully starting in a few weeks. I think we're going to start with Ed Madros's favorite subject, the the Walnut Street Synagogue in Chelsea will be #1 on this new kind of approach to following up, because there's no way that we've done justice to this topic. I'm sorry, there's no way.
Oh,
So this is a new ongoing project that I asked Dr. Gruber to do. He has agreed. So keep watching, join our YouTube channel, and you'll see that we'll be dropping standalone 20-25 minute presentations on a variety of topics of Jewish preservation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ari.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. I look forward to seeing you again at some other event.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Get vaccinated.